calling someone insane, calling someone a visionary. The definition has changed through the ages. And today people still have a problem with the term occult and magic. They prefer the words mystic instead of magician. Throughout our interview, I'm gonna keep using the word magician.
Good.
Which you have used for yourself. Another word that I'm going to keep using in a bit of an unorthodox way is the term poet. I refer to you as a poet, although you have not focused on poetry throughout your career, because in Greek, the poet is the one who creates. Any creator, any maker of worlds is a poet. And therefore, this is the word that I use for people who are artists.
That is perfectly fine by me.
As a rule. And speaking of Greece, I'm going to take you back to Greece for a while.
Please do.
As you know, in classical times, it was the rule to refer to the voice of inspiration as a muse or a demon. We had Socrates' daemonion that was advising him on philosophical matters, challenging him. Homer was invoking the muse before he wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad. Today, it's no longer in fashion to talk about these things. It is all rationalized and mechanized. We're seen as engineers of language rather than visionary artists. How do you define yourself? Do you see yourself as an occult literary artist? And do you feel that you have your own daemonion? I know that you're working with your patron deity called Glikon, which means the sweet.
Sweetie.
In Greek. Sweetie. Exactly. Yeah. Would you tell me a bit more about Glikon? When was the first time when you definitely knew that you had a connection with a being? I don't know how you would define this being. I will leave it up to you.
Well, I mean, what you were saying about Hellenistic Greece and that tradition is quite interesting, because I've just finished yesterday reading the book from Strange Attractor Press, Selene, by my dearest friend Steve Moore, which is a marvellous classical. It's classical scholarship.
It is. I'm reading that book as well.
It is wonderful, and it is going into that tradition of vision and cave oracles and all of those things. And it was Steve Moore pretty much living the life of the figure Endymion. Up there in his house on Shooter's Hill, rather than in a cave on Mount Latmos. It was Steve who inspired me to be a magician in the first place. And it was him, once I had made the decision to announce that I was a magician, when I was quite drunk on my 40th birthday at a biker bar.
Was that in 1994?
That was in 1993, November of 1993. And I was at this wonderful party. I think the Jazz Butcher was playing. And I said, from henceforth, I am going to be a magician. And then the next morning, I had to, when I'd sobered up, and I realised I'm going to have to actually do that, or I'm going to look stupid. And then I had to deal with the fact that I'd got no idea what a magician was or what magicians did.
So this announcement came from drunkenness, or because it was inspired by the activities of Steve?
It was a bit of both. And it was my 40th birthday. It felt like I should mark the occasion. So when I went to Steve and I asked him, how do you go about entering into magic? And he said that for his money, the best thing to do was to either find a god or to let a god find you. I think the reasoning was that if you are entering into a completely imaginary territory, then it might be a good idea to have an imaginary friend who is familiar with that territory to act as a kind of guide. So I set about trying to think what kind of God I might be attracted to. And I wasn't getting very far. I mean, lots of the gods looked wonderful, but I couldn't really see one that seemed to be...
To resonate with you.
To resonate with me in the same way that Selene resonated with Steve. Then when I was at Steve, he was showing me a book of Roman antiquity. And he asked me if I'd ever seen Alexander's serpent, Glykon. And I said, no, I hadn't. And he showed me this statue that had been unearthed, I think, at Constanta. It had been dug up at Constanta. It was a Glykon, this humanoid-headed serpent with long blonde hair, or I assume it was blonde anyway. And it was the most fantastic thing and the most beautiful and comical thing that I'd ever seen. And I thought, yes, that is the God for me. So I made an image. I started to work upon an image of the God. I started thinking about the God, and then within a couple of months, in January 1994, we had a very unusual experience. Yes. We'd taken some magic mushrooms just recreationally, as we'd done many times before. But something about our conversation, which was talking, we weren't actually doing ritual magic. Mm-hmm. We were talking about what kind of magic we might do. And we were wondering whether things like the William Burroughs, Brian Gysin cut-up technique might be applicable to magic. Mm-hmm. And then it started to get very, very strange. It's very difficult to give a complete account of without sounding completely mad and incoherent. But
I understand, yeah.
We both felt that we were suddenly in a very different state to any state that we had been in before.
So you had crossed over somewhere else.
It felt that it was not purely accountable by the magic mushrooms that we'd taken. This felt like something different. I found myself talking in a different voice, just snatches of words that seemed to be something speaking through me rather than me speaking.
Like glossolalia.
Not quite glossolalia. It was actual phrases in English that were cryptic and which I have thought about a great deal since to see if there was any meaning in them. And yeah, kind of there was. We had this experience that it was like the magical experience. It was a taste of it. It was telling us that it was possible, that it was real.
Amazing.
We had moments during that where we were both independently sharing the same thoughts without knowing it. And after that, reality was on a different footing and on quite a precarious footing for a while, because the biggest danger with magic is that you will go mad.
Yeah.
And for a few months, I think we were both trying to metabolize what had happened to us and to try and find a way to make that work in the material world that we existed in. It seemed that, to me, my first intimations were, all right, it's not enough just doing this and knowing this. The duty is to communicate it. And the best way to communicate the experience is through art, is through poetry, is through... I was thinking, this is something that is an idea that is completely new to me. I am the first person to ever have this idea. What I'm going to do is talk about magic using music and poetry and bits of theatre and things like that to overwhelm people with this kind of rush of intense experience. And then, of course, I found out that that is what people have been doing since Paleolithic times.
Yes.
That's the basis of most of our religions. And this is what Monteverdi was doing when he more or less invented opera as a way of talking about alchemy. And that was a very fluorescent period that lasted for probably 6 years, something like that. That phase of my magical experience, where we were doing a lot of the albums, the recordings of the various
the Moon and Serpent.
The Moon and Serpent magical performances.
So this is how you became the Moon and Serpent. The Moon was Steve.
The Moon was Steve, and I was the Serpent. We originally, that phrase, the Moon and Serpent, Grand Egyptian Theatre of Marvels, it just tumbled out of my head when I was in the recording studio with Tim Perkins, and he'd got some music that he thought a kind of carnival spiel might be appropriate for, and so I came up with that phrase. Steve liked it as well. It was only later that we realised that in magic, very few things happen completely by accident.
Synchronicity.
Exactly. We found out that conjunction of the Moon and Serpent, we hadn't realised before, but Alexander of Abanotoikos, the creator of Glykon, had been performing these 3-day-long annual, it was a kind of a cross between the mystery religions and something like the Glastonbury Festival. It was open to the public, unlike the mystery religions.
Yeah, it was more like the outer court of the mysteries.
Yes.
Because, for instance, in Greece, in the Elefsis mysteries, there was the outer mysteries that were available to all the public.
Well, it was more or less taking the, like, say, the Eleusinian mysteries, which were for the devotees of that mystery religion.
Yes.
It was taking the inner mysteries and making them outer mysteries.
I see. That's very,
which was very radical.
It is very radical.
And Alexander of Abanotoikos, much as he's presented by Lucian as a complete fraud, a charlatan, and much, much worse, actually, you have to remember that Lucian was a sophist. He was in the same profession as Alexander, but Alexander was doing better at it. And Lucian, as a satirist, was not necessarily telling the truth. One thing that we can say about Alexander was that he was a Pythagorean, and that he may have been dispatched from the nearby Pythagorean stronghold of Aea.
Yes.
And that Glykon was probably an outgrowth of statue animation, which was something that the Pythagoreans had absorbed from the Neoplatonists. This was the idea that you could take an icon of a god. This could be like a statue, or it could be like Steve Moore's tiny little picture of Cellini. And that by meditation, you could come to understand that, I think it's something like all right, gods are idea forms. They are real idea forms.
Yes.
Thus, the idea of a god is the god. A representation of the god is the idea of the god made visible, thus is the god.
Yeah.
So by this kind of meditation, you could come to understand that your statue of Hermes was actually embodying the god Hermes. Yeah. Now, I think that what Alexander was doing with Glycon was taking this technology to the next level. I think that Glycon was like Blu-ray theology, that this was a case where you'd got an image of the god, but the image of the god was moving and it was answering back. It was obviously, I would say, I mean, Lucian came up with a very, very over-elaborate explanation. He said that it was herons, gizzards, all stitched together to make a speaking tube. It was ventriloquism.
Yes.
But I think that this was probably the origin of ventriloquism as a kind of sacred technology. And I think that the audience at the Glycon Mysteries, they would have known that it was a puppet. They were just understanding the puppet differently. It's sort of, and of course, we found out that not only did these 3-day extravaganzas include the mysteries of Glycon, they also included the mysteries of Selene. In fact, Alexander seems to have based his entire cult around the conjunction of this new incarnation of Asclepius and the Endymion story, which he acted out at the end of it. Now, we realised as we progressed further into magic that actually in the Kabbalistic system, the 3 highest spheres, they're pretty much the 3 heads of God. There is Keter is God considered as both male and female, as a kind of a unified hermaphrodite totality. Hokmah is God considered as male. And Faina is God considered as female. Now, the Faina is the sphere of all of the mother goddesses, all of the highest aspect of the moon. So all of the lunar goddesses, the celestial lunar goddesses, are at Faina. At Hokmah, actually the best god to represent Hokmah is a snake god.
Okay.
Because
the solar phallic.
It is phallic.
Yeah.
It is Hokmah means wisdom.
The serpent, yes.
And the serpent is allegedly wise.
Yeah.
Thus, the conjugation of the highest male and the highest female principle is exactly the conjugation of the moon and the serpent. And Jean Cocteau, he said, and he was a very, very good magician as well as a very good artist.
He's one of my favorites.
He was saying that all art, all creation, all human creativity, it only comes from the union between the highest male and the highest female parts of ourselves.
Yes.
That union of Hokmah and Faina from which the whole universe progresses. So, yeah, I mean, this was the beginning of my understanding that art, any kind of creativity and magic are, if not precisely the same thing, are almost interchangeable. In our hopefully forthcoming bumper book of magic, me and Steve came up with...
going to ask about.
Well, we came up with a new definition of magic because we've always had problems with the traditional definitions of magic, which seem to be more based upon the will of the magician.
Yes, Crowley's definition.
Yeah, and bringing about changes in reality in accordance with your will.
But not so much inside.
No, well, it's... I tend to think that, for one thing, I'm not sure that you can bring about changes in reality. I am a determinist and an eternalist.
You're answering another one of my questions.
I'm probably going to be doing that quite a bit, Lena. But sort of, it was that sort of that feeling that we defined magic as any purposeful engagement with the phenomena or possibilities of consciousness. We thought that more or less included everything that magic originally included, which was all of science, all of art, all of consciousness. At least a purposeful engagement with it, seeing what can be done with consciousness.
So would you say that magic is the science of the imagination then?
Yes, or the art of the imagination.
Yes.
Yeah, it's because science, which is the most wonderful and elegant tool that we have ever created with which to examine the physical universe, as long as it doesn't go beyond the material universe, it's fine. It's perfect. But science cannot really talk about consciousness. In fact, science has spent quite a lot of time trying to prove that consciousness doesn't really exist, because that would fit better with the construction of science.
With the materialist.
Yeah, that's it. And science has a number of blind spots. For example, I believe that if telepathy and subjects like that were any other kind of subject, they would have been accepted long ago. Apparently, there is more proof for the existence of telepathy than for the fact that we should take 75 milligrams of aspirin every day. And yet I do the aspirin, and so do a lot of people that I know. But apparently telepathy and sort of the psi sciences or whatever will be forever beyond that. You need, I think, to bring together the parts of human consciousness that have been divided up. I tend to see original magical practice as being Paleolithic shamanism, and right there in those weird old guys and women with antlers attached to their heads, dancing in the firelight. What they were doing was they were inventing the visual arts, they were inventing writing, they were inventing poetry, they were inventing music, they were inventing acting, they were inventing light shows, they were inventing everything, this immersive theatre, pretty much like Monteverdi was attempting. And with these new art forms, these tools of consciousness, they would transmit their vision, their ecstasy, to the entire of their community, the entire of their tribe. And that was fine. That worked pretty well for tens of thousands of years. What happened was we discovered urban settlement. Now, when we had urban settlements, which were going to happen, you know, these things, if we have an idea, we're going to pretty much, whether it's a good or bad idea, we're going to use it. So, yeah, urban settlements happened, and for the first time, people they didn't have to grow their own food, which meant that they could become specialists.
Which you explore in Voice of the Fire a lot in Hobbes Hog.
Yeah.
This is exactly the idea that is present there.
They could become specialists. I mean, originally you've got your shaman, and the shaman will be doing everything. He will be advising the leader of the tribe. So that's a political activity. He will be responsible he or she will be responsible for all of the medicine, for all of the dispensing of visions in the form of art. But once you've got settled communities, once people can grow their own food, then you can get priests emerging, and they will have their centralized religions, which will be just theirs, and for their specific gods. You will also get people like those well-known bastards, artists and writers emerging, and they will take away magic's task as the dispenser of visions.
And of healing as well, the healing aspect.
Well, the healing will still be there for a while. In fact, that will be magic's biggest go-to function for a long, long time.
Yeah, but healing for the soul?
Well, until you get to the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, you've suddenly got medicine and science both emerging out of the parent culture of magic, but anxious to throw off the associations that magic has got. And that really only left magic with access to the inner world. And then in 1910, or around about then, you've got Sigmund Freud turning up and taking away that function of magic. So I think that you could say that in the modern world, in our culture, we are actually living amongst the dismembered corpse of magic.
Exactly, yeah.
Which to me seems to fit with the alchemical idea of solve et coagula. That you could see the whole of human culture thus far as the process of solve. That we originally have magic as a single thing. It's a one-stop philosophy that includes everything within our awareness, but we dismantle that, we deconstruct that, we reduce it into its various parts so that we can understand it better. And that is something that we do as humans. If we've got a very complex thing, we take it apart in the hope of understanding it better. But that is only the first part of the process. That is solve. Now there is the difficult part, which is coagula, which is synthesis, which is putting all of those bits of our disparate understanding back together in a way that works better or which is more fully understood. I think that is the human task at the moment.
I have a question in 3 parts related to what you just said. So, in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, 2009, you have Mina saying, within 100 years, culture has declined. This very controversial phrase. And we see nowadays, the way I see it, our era parallels very much what happened post-World War I, with the disenchantment following the war and escapist tendencies coming through, in a time that is the current time. For me, it has something else as well. It's very Lovecraftian, in the sense that it is like science fiction, the worst of dystopian science fiction, together with horror. And this brings a lot of despair and apathy to people, while at the same time, as I know from you, you had mentioned in an older interview, there was a poll at the time, around 2009, when 20% of youths said that they would be ashamed if their mates caught them reading. So we live in a culture that is paralyzed by fear, and at the same time it is ignorant. People are ashamed of reading.
Yes.
In this culture, and another feature is, we spoke before of the power of the word that the old poets and magicians, because it was one and the same at the time, they had. And poetry was written to be spoken. They were also orators and bards, and they had immense power in the sense that they could take down tyrants with their satire or raise kings with their praise. Today, if you're a visionary artist, but you don't have the support of like so-and-so big company, publishing house, media, conglomerate, or whatever, they don't censor you anymore, but they have found a more clever way, which is ignoring you.
Yes.
You don't exist, therefore you have no voice. Your word, it has no strength. How do we take back this power?
I would say that this is something that all artists need to address. I would say that, firstly, you must realise how culpable and complicit you are in this. Mm-hmm. You could have said no. But, of course, that would not have given you as big an audience. Yeah. But you could have said no. You could have found another way to do it. Yeah. You could have actually had the respect for yourself as an artist that people used to have for artists back in the bardic tradition that you were talking about, where if you'd had a witch put a curse upon you, I mean, what was that going to do? It was going to make your hens lay funny for a little while. Perhaps the milk would be curdled. No big deal. However, if a bard put a satire upon you, that would destroy you in the eyes of everybody who knew you, possibly even in your own eyes. And if it was a good enough satire, then 200 years after you were dead, people would still be laughing at you. So that was the power that artists used to have. But now I think we have been led into regarding ourselves as commercial talent that is lucky to have a job. Yeah,
entertainers, not
entertainers anymore, that are providing some escapist relief for this grinding and punishing modern society. I think that we ought to take back some of, and purely to ourselves, in the way that we feel about ourselves and what we are doing as creators, we should take back some of that power. We should insist that, and this involves making our art good enough by putting everything into it, putting all that we are and all that we have into whatever we are working on. I mean, Aleister Crowley is somebody that I have very mixed feelings about. He, as a person, I don't think I could have bared to be in the same room as. However, he did say some quite profound and often wonderful things. And I remember him talking about his obsession with the goddess, the apocalyptic goddess Babylon.
Babylon, yes.
And he was saying that there is Babylon riding on her seven-headed beast, and she is lifting her goblet
cup of abomination,
above. And he said that the saints must drain every last drop of their blood into her goblet and not withhold the least amount, because otherwise the whole venture will be for nothing. Now, I actually understand that upon a creative level, that if I've put everything that I've got into a work, then yes, that is exhausting, but it's not, it's an exhaustion where you get all of that energy back every time you look at that work. Whereas if there's a little bit that isn't quite right, where you haven't quite worked hard enough, then that will be irritating you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Take it from me. You know, so we have to, as creators, we have to be prepared to work on a different level, to work on a level of absolute intensity, the whole of ourselves, or our daemon, if you like.
Yeah.
That thing that is inside us, that is not our emotions, that is not our intellect, that is not our imagination, that is not our body, whatever you choose to call it, soul, daemon, will, self, it's sort of those things. That is what should be driving everything that we do.
I find it very appropriate that you mentioned Babylon in relation to all this, because there is a tendency to regard this goddess, this archetype, whatever you want to call her, as a goddess of pleasure, the divine prostitute, they call her. And they don't understand that most people don't, that when you speak of this cup where you have to pour everything of you into it, that involves a lot of pain. And it's the same with the artistic process. People who are not artists, especially today where the artist is conflated with the entertainer, they think it's all fun. We live like in a rose bubble most of the time. But if you want to make real art, the kind of art that cannot be bought, then you have to put, as you said, all of yourself in there. And that involves sacrifice.
Yes.
And sometimes it is a terrible sacrifice, isn't it? There is a price to pay for working with these forces.
I tend to find that if you are working with a pure heart and good aim and noble intentions, then yes, there will be a price, but it will always kind of be a price worth paying.
Yes.
For what you receive. I mean, you will have to give up things that you probably shouldn't have been that concerned about anyway.
I see what you mean.
I mean, like, say, for example, on a purely material level, maintaining my own integrity has meant actually refusing staggering sums of money, just purely for the pleasure of knowing that it was not about the money.
Your integrity was
it was
intact.
purely about my integrity, and knowing that my integrity is at least worth a few million. And I think potentially
Priceless.
Billions, priceless. Yeah. Now, that means that not having that money, sometimes it perhaps would have been easier, or perhaps not. I've got by. The people that I love have got by with me. That was all I wanted. I am completely happy with my life here in Northampton. It's where I can actually put what I've learned about magic to some practical use.
Now that you mentioned Northampton, I found your Northampton to be a place, a liminal place, through your writing, betwixt and between. It's here, but it's also not here. It is everyone's Northampton. For example, me, a Greek, reading your stories in Greece, I was reconstructing something in my mind, which it exists and it doesn't when I'm here. So in magic, like in occultism, as you know, many traditions work with the so-called Geni Loki, the spirits of the place.
Spiritual place, yeah.
Would you say that these are rather the psychogeography of a place? So the fantastical, the imaginary dimension of the place, that this is the genius of the place for you?
Well, I would say that actually the imaginary landscape
Yeah, exactly.
is the one that the real landscape is standing upon. I would say that the spirit of the place is everything, because, yeah, that is what the whole process is predicated upon. And what we've got in Northampton at the moment, sometime early last year, we became the first British town to collapse under austerity. We're not even a proper town anymore. We're in special measures, and this has
like my country then. Yes.
Well, it's been quite brutal. The most vulnerable members of the community are now at risk. That is sick people, old people, and particularly homeless people. You may have noticed the number of tents that are in some of the doorways.
Oh, yes, I have. And it's the same in London, unfortunately. I've worked in the past with homeless people.
Yeah.
As a humanitarian
journalist. Now, Northampton has been marginalised as a British town since Saxon times, when we were the most important British town. We were the centre of the country as decreed by God when one of his angels apparently sent a pilgrim from Jerusalem, bringing this stone cross, which was a point of pilgrimage. And then King Alfred said that Northampton was foremost amongst the shires, which was when we were the centre of Mercia, and Mercia was the most important of the British kingdoms. And we are at the centre of the country. I think it's because Robert Graves said something similar about magic mushrooms. He said that in cultures where the mushroom was sacred, it is reviled and is taboo and is talked about as shits or snots or things like that. Dirty, don't touch it. I think that a similar thing has happened to Northampton. I think that because we were originally a sacred spot, we have been cast out into a special kind of liminal darkness. And this is purely because our mythology has been taken away from us. We do not have the kind of the self-satisfied mythology that, say, London has accumulated. And yet, nearly everything seems to have happened in Northampton. And I believe that one of the applications of magic is to reinvest the physical world around us with the kind of lifeblood of legend and mythology.
I was going to say, because before you said you don't really believe that you can affect changes in the world in accordance to your will. But at the same time, if you change the fictional landscape, if you make changes to that level of reality, as you said, by infusing a place's life force with myths, remembering the ancestors, remembering the magical power of the past, then maybe you can change the base level of reality as well.
Well, you perhaps can't change what happens in the base level of reality, but you can change what it means.
Yeah, consciousness.
You can give meaning to things. I think one of the problems with the contemporary world is that meaning has bled out of it. Things, facts, truths, information, this has all become so relativized. Nobody knows that one fact is any truer than another. Meaning has bled out of things. People don't seem to believe that things have meaning. It's perhaps as a result of scientific materialism, which has assured us for over a century that, no, things don't have any meaning. I mean, this is what Lovecraft was responding to back in the early 20th century. And I mean, what you were saying about times today being similar to around exactly a century ago. This is something that I've been thinking as well, that when I was working with Melinda on Lost Girls, we kind of came to the conclusion that the 20th century hadn't really got started until around about, what, sort of 1917, 1918, that you could look at things like, say, the first performance of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, this stunning, revolutionary piece of music that really upset everything. And around the same time, you've got Einstein coming in a few years later and explaining that, no, we are not a particularly important part of the universe, and the universe is much bigger than we'd thought, and it all means something different. You've got every field of human endeavour suddenly
questioned and overturned, right?
The tensions of the new century and our technology and how much we knew seemed to come to a head around about sort of the early sort of, just before the, not 1913, around about then.
But now we have an added level of horror to this. Back then, it was the structure of the traditional universe that was questioned and overturned by all these new discoveries. Yeah. Now, with all this emphasis, and I particularly in London, because my circle involves a lot of scientists and people in technology who explore some very dystopian paths, in my view. There is a lot of prominence given to transhumanism, to virtual reality, to technologies that basically are meant to alter our very senses, which I find quite disturbing, because the senses is what our other sense, the intuition, processes, and then we have imagination. So when you interfere with the senses, you are going to interfere with the imagination as well. Yes. So, and you interfere with the very basis of being human. So now we have the concept of humanity itself being overturned, and that's horrifying to many people, and we don't know where we're going. Something's changing,
but we don't know exactly what it's changing into or changing from necessarily. I'd say that, working with this film and the number of embedded projects within the film. I've tried to construct this film quite cleverly so that it includes lots of things. You'll see adverts for a computer game called Escapism, which is rumoured. Well, it's in the world of the film. It's apparently already causing mental problems for teenagers.
Okay, that's very interesting.
We've actually, my daughter Amber has already worked on the game book. Yeah. Is a brief mention. There's a brief shot of something from Electric Comics, which is something that I worked on with my daughter Leah, a kind of digital comics. And it's like with all of this, we're hoping. Hang on, I've lost a thread here. What were we just talking about?
We were talking about how we have completely our notion of being human through all these new technologies is being overturned.
One of the things that I've been exploring lots of new technology to try and find out how to best use it. And this included an experience with virtual reality. Yes. And I found it very, very compelling.
Compelling, yes.
This was with my friend Scott down in Brighton. He was showing me, because he's a wizard at it, and he was showing me various virtual reality scenarios, a kind of a paint box scenario where you could create things in virtual reality. That was a lot of fun.
That's beautiful.
That was
because
wonderful.
Then you have the input from the human mind as well.
Yeah.
You fill in the gaps like with the novel.
It was terrific.
Yeah.
Then he showed me a virtual landscape where I'm standing on the side of a mountain on a kind of a little rocky platform and looking out across a chasm. And across the chasm, there's somebody else on a rocky platform who keeps putting their foot over the edge and then flinching back. And then Scott said to me, all right, go to the edge of the rock platform. And so I did. He said, have a look down. So I looked down and there's this immense drop, thousands of feet, you know, to a canyon far below. And he said, right, take a step over the edge of the canyon then. Take a step off the edge of the platform. And I thought, right, I know that it's just floor.
Yeah.
I know that. So, yeah, I can do that. But I couldn't.
No, you didn't. I've had the same experience.
I couldn't move. And so I thought, all right, I can get round this. I'll shut my eyes.
Okay.
Shut my eyes and then I'll be able... And I couldn't. Because my mind was saying, no, we don't throw ourselves off of a chasm, even if we've got our eyes shut. You're not doing this. And then I realised that actually the environment that you're in actually overrides your own kind of volition. Yeah. And I started to realise that, yes, you could do something wonderful with virtual reality. I was thinking... visionary experiences.
I have a friend who has done exactly that. He creates virtual reality experiences, and one of the experiences he has created is a near-death one. So you jump from the top of a skyscraper, very similar to what you just described, and then he takes you through what might be happening after, and then you return.
Yeah.
It would be... I'm not going to spoil it for you because maybe you will have the chance to try it if you want.
Yeah.
But yeah,
but that is one application. But the sort of the other thing is that I'm not a big fan of television because I have long been aware that actually television has changed the way that human beings actually relate to each other, relate to the world that is around them. Yeah. So. And I know that people can get lost in television. I know that there were people who write in, if somebody in a soap opera, if their wife in the soap opera is having an affair, they will write in to tell the actor, because, look, I didn't want you to be the last to know, but your wife's having an affair. Because they have they've failed to make a distinction between the reality on the screen and reality. Now, people could do that even with print media. They could believe that H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon was some kind of real thing. So to do that with a completely wraparound reality. And when I was talking to Scott after this thing, I said, how long before the haptic glove or the haptic bodysuit? I already note that there are ways of making smells in the virtual world. And you can actually, by using, I think, sound, you can create stuff that you could chew. All these exist. There's nothing in your mouth that you could chew it.
Everything that you're telling me about exists.
Yeah. And now that kind of reality...
It's our reality now.
Suck people in completely so that they had no idea what was real, what wasn't. I fear that this is something that we will probably go through.
We will.
I don't think we have an option upon this because of the way that humans and their technology seem to work. if something is possible, we will probably do it, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And if it's profitable to some people, then we will definitely do it.
Faustian society.
Well, yeah, it's sort of, I think that the best way of seeing this is, or at least a model that I've found useful, is that in terms of Kabbalah and Tarot, it is said that the Tarot trumps, the major arcana, contain a kind of inbuilt prophecy. Which ends with the universe card.
Yes.
Now, that is the 32nd of the tarot paths. The first 10 are the spheres of the Kabbalah. The next 22 are the tarot trumps. So there is the idea, and that is also the tarot path that connects the material world of Malkut with the lunar dream world of Yesod. Now, it strikes me that we are at a point in our relationship with our technology, with our relationship with reality, that is becoming more mutable. I suspect that we might be moving as a species from having our consciousness and our psychology based entirely in the material world to having our consciousness and our psychology based in the virtual world.
And in between, isn't it?
Yeah. It's sort of, I think that at this stage, we are probably going through, if that is the case, if that is what is happening, and it would seem to be, that we're approaching a different relationship with reality where we can choose, or at least we have the illusion of choice. I'm thinking of things like Second Life, which, no, actually, you're still in First Life. You're just pretending to be in, which is like, say, Dungeons and Dragons games. And I can understand that, you know, but if it's just escapism, that won't work, because this world will fall to bits, and then all of the second and third lives will fall to bits with it. So this has to be a different sort of virtuality, not one where we're lost in some kind of role-playing game, but it has to be a different relationship with our imagination. Perhaps a greater understanding of what imagination is and how it is the fountainhead that has got us here, that none of this would exist if it hadn't come bubbling out of someone's imagination at some time, including the language that we are speaking in, the clothes that we are wearing, the room that we're in, these microphones, everything. That has all come from the imagination. And we do not understand imagination any more than we understand consciousness.
It is conflated with escapism, sadly.
Yes.
It is seen, the preoccupation with magic, for instance. We're talking about magic today a lot. Some would say, how is this not escapism?
Yeah. I mean, like, to me, magic is, at this stage, I mean, we were talking earlier about the first years of my magical experience, which involved an awful lot of rituals and an awful lot of psychedelic drugs and an awful lot of entities and spectacular experiences. Magic isn't like that for me anymore. I suspect that back at that time, I needed all that stuff in order to convince me that there were, as a rationalist, that there was anything of worth in the occult. I think I needed that kind of direct experience. But now I know how these things work, and I know what my work is, and it doesn't necessarily involve an awful lot of encounters with gods or demons, because the gods and demons, they're all internalized.
That's what I was going to say. It does. It is a direct experience through your art, through your writing. That is a direct experience.
That is my magical practice. Sitting down and writing, whatever it is, I am writing. I am bringing to bear upon that sensibilities that have been completely informed by my magical experience. It's it gets into everything. I mean, we were talking about poetry and magic. In the film, there is an exact kind of summary of that formula. There's a bit where one of the characters is saying that talking about the Frank Metterton character that I play, and he's saying, yeah, apparently he was a black magician. And this one says, really? And says, yeah, apparently he was in that a magical order that had been started by that poet W.B. Yeats. And at which point the woman says, well, I suppose poetry and magic, I suppose they're pretty much the same thing. All of the evocation and the invocation, it's sort of, they share a language, poetry and magic.
And the practice as well, because you spoke before of ventriloquism, and this is exactly what writers do, right? When we write, we impersonate all these characters. You are a man, but you also speak through the mouth of a woman, of another race, another sexuality, another species, exactly. So it's all about ventriloquism. And that reminds me of another entity that you've mentioned, apart from Glycon, that has been recurring in your work, Asmodeus. And you mention the flight of Asmodeus, that is a gift of this goetic entity. And that flight, to me at least, it resembles a lot the flight of the imagination of a writer, because the houses, as you fly over them, they become transparent and you can see the lives of the people within. And this is exactly what we do when we write.
That is true. That is true.
So I mean,
I hope I've got a reasonable relationship with Asmodeus. I tend to find with most of these entities that as long as you are publicising them in the right way, they tend to be okay with that. And I first encountered Asmodeus, or what I believe to have been Asmodeus. This was in the February of 1994, completely by accident. Very frightening at first, and when I realised that, oh shit, this is actually a demon, I'd thought that they were kind of hypothetical, but this doesn't seem to be hypothetical. And eventually I managed to have quite an interesting conversation, and asked if I found out what his name was. I got the sense of something with a sense of humour, and something with an emotional register very close to human beings. Unlike gods, which are kind of abstract principles. They've got immense love in them, or stuff like, but they're not so messy and humanoid and emotional.
It's more detached
as demons are. It's different. But with Asmodeus, I had this experience where I felt, as I was explaining it to Melinda, who was in the room with me but couldn't actually see him. She could sense a presence but couldn't actually see him in the way that I could. And I was saying that, what he's showing me is that he's really good with mathematics, and he's got a beautiful grasp of pattern and design. And he's also showing me that he's got at least one more dimension than we've got, and he's flaunting it a bit. He keeps turning himself inside out through a dimension that we don't have or is not apparent to us. And later, when I checked it out, it said that the Asmodeus is the demon of mathematics.
Brings knowledge
and of craft, of handicraft. And when I started thinking about the Asmodeus flight, where you're taken up above the buildings and you can see them, as you say, as if their roofs were gone. I thought, actually, that sounds more like being taken up a mathematical dimension.
Okay.
Because, I mean, for example, if you were a two-dimensional person living in a two-dimensional world, and I drew a square around you,
yes,
you would be completely enclosed. Just as three-dimensional creatures, we are completely enclosed by this three-dimensional room.
Yeah, like a triangle.
Yeah, but it's like if you were, as a three-dimensional person looking down upon that two-dimensional person in their two-dimensional square, you can see them. You can see down through a dimension that they don't have. You could reach down and pick them up and put them down outside their square without passing through the wall.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that the same thing would apply with an Asmodeus flight.
Yeah.
That he's taking you can look down upon sealed buildings, but you can see around the edge in a dimension that we don't have. And it struck me that is Asmodeus fourth dimensional? And then I read a book about the mathematics. This was not an occult book. This was a book about the mathematics of the fourth dimension. And at the end of it, the guy was allowing himself a bit of play, if you like. And he was saying, so what would a fourth dimensional entity look like? And he said, well, I think it would look like multiple copies of itself at different sizes in a kind of lattice work.
Legion.
Well, it's sort of my drawing of Asmodeus that I'd done. There is a spider, but the same spider is repeated at different scales, as if it was moving forward in a kind of solid time.
Yeah.
And it struck me that, there might be something to that. Of course, I always have to bear in mind that there might be nothing to it, and it might be a voice from inside your own head. But as we were saying earlier, that's still pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
You know? But, I mean, I've dragged Asmodeus into service in a number of different books and comics and things like that. Yeah. And in the show, the forthcoming feature film.
When should we expect this, by the way?
I'm guessing end of the year.
That's good. That's great.
Maybe autumn, winter.
Because I know it's been forthcoming for quite some time.
Well, it's we got it finished in December last year, and it's turning out quite remarkable. If we can, this is applied magic, as I was talking about, because Northampton is on the ropes. Now, if we have done this film well enough, and I think we probably have, then there might very well be a TV series following on from it. In some ways, the whole of the feature film is a very elaborate pilot episode that will make people hopefully want to see more of all of these characters and situations. But if we could do that, then that, on a very practical level, would hopefully bring in some of the attention that, say, Game of Thrones has brought to Northern Ireland and sort of to Ireland in general. And if all of that could be used to actually repair Northampton.
Yeah, to serve the community in some way. Which is, incidentally, it is a a function of the old poets, the bards, the Fili of the Celtic tradition. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. The purpose always was also to give back to your community.
Of course.
And you do that a lot with your work. You give back. And I've noticed, especially with language, you've said that you are trying to build a visionary English language again.
Yes.
And in your work, you often use idioms and phrases that are unique to Northampton, that are unique to this area. Like, it reminds me a bit of the magical process of de fictiones from the Greek magical papyri. So you would write in this kind of glossolalia with idiomatic phrases from the area that you were from, or made up phrases even, your spells, and you would cast them into liminal places like graves, like lakes,
Crossroads.
Crossroads, things like this. And I've been thinking that writing, and especially writing in these terms, it is a bit like casting a spell. What does it mean for you to cast a novel, to cast a poem out in the world?
Of course it's a spell. I mean, like, the very language is the same, isn't it? I mean, like, to spell a word or to cast a spell. The fact that a book of magical secrets is called a grimoire, which is just a grammar. It's that all of this is, this is exactly what I do. This is my living. That I started out in the boroughs in Northampton in a working class family, and I identify very, very strongly with the working class. Now, I was put through what was at the time called the 11+ system, which is an examination that you take when you're 11 that will decide the rest of your life.
Yeah, we have something similar in Greece called Panhellenic examination. So you enter uni if you pass through these exams, otherwise you don't go anywhere.
Now, the 11+ was designed to do, as I heard it described by another person who he was also born in the boroughs, Jeremy Seabrook. He went on to write a brilliant book called The Unprivileged about post-war poverty in Britain. But when he was asked in a biography of me, someone had got in touch with Jeremy Seabrook and said, "Do you remember Alan Moore when you taught him as his French master in the first year at grammar?" And he didn't, but he remembered the area that I came from. And he was saying about, the 11+ was generally designed to cream off the most intelligent couple of % of the working class and tempt them up into the lower rungs of the middle class, rather than go back and enrich the communities that they had come from. Now, luckily, since I got expelled from school as a drug dealer at the age of 17, that wasn't my trajectory. So I was able to, I retained that fierce commitment to the class and the place that I came from. And I think it has done both of us good.
You give back to the community as a singer of tales, then. You preserve the ancestral memory.
That's it. And it's sort of, and people have said that they've visited Northampton, and my friend, the comedian Stuart Lee, he was saying that he's quite used to walking around London and coming across a street and thinking, oh, that's what Arthur Machen wrote about, or, oh, Charles Dickens, he set his novel here. And everywhere in London has got that associations with fiction and with fable and with mythology. But, of course, in Northampton, nowhere has, except that after reading Jerusalem or Voice of the Fire, that Stuart was saying that now he comes to, it's been re-enchanted.
What about in one of the stories in Voice of the Fire, Cremation Fields, the impersonator of Hussein, he has to go through basically learning the ley lines of the land in order to work magic. That's what her father who is obviously not her father, but she pretends to be his daughter, he teaches her that. He's trying to teach her that. What about bringing that to reality and doing exactly what London is doing with those tours of, occult London, the ley lines of London? Couldn't the same thing apply here?
Well, yeah,
what you do in your books?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that when I'm luckily dead and not around to see this stuff, there's going to be Jerusalem tours, and there's probably going to be things like that, which, now, to me, as long as the place can be kept alive in the imagination, then that is fine. It's sort of the recreation of a place. No, that can't happen because everywhere is gone. Yeah. It's already gone. Everything that it's as we're sitting here, this place is gone. We are gone. Yes. Everything's gone. So the only place that it can endure is in the imagination, which is to say, in a kind of mythology,
memory.
In memory,
but in the sense of the myth of Odin, with his ravens, thought and memory, and he was more afraid of the loss of memory rather than thought, because it is the marriage of the two that brings you creativity. Well,
this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I had a friend of mine who had a very unusual experience of memory loss, where she more or less, in a kind of an incident that she's still unpicking, her brain suddenly made an executive decision and kind of wound her tape back to when she was 8 years old. So all of a sudden, the memory of anything after that was gone. And it was, in effect, if you imagine an 8-year-old girl in
the body
in 2010,
time travel, being stuck in
suddenly being thrown forward into a world where there's Donald Trump and Brexit and new technologies and all of this stuff. And that made me realise that other than memory, there's nothing to us.
No.
The people that we love, our most heartfelt political beliefs, that's fine as long as you remember those things.
Yeah.
It's sort of, it's sort of, memory is a very important thing. And of course, art and any form of creativity its first application must have been that it fixed time, it fixed memory. That bison that you saw the other day, that you did a kind of an outline of, and that every time you look at that bison, you remember the one that you based it upon. You've fixed that moment in time.
Yes.
It's and eventually we would have realised that, oh, actually, the guy who drew that bison, he died several years ago, but the bison's still here. So he's still with us, because that's what art does. It projects your ideas, your being, the way that you think. I mean, reading through Steve's book, Selene, it was an intense experience for me, because I thought, if anybody wanted to know how Steve Moore thought, they should read this book. Just that intellect that I remember from all of our conversations, who would get unaccountably furious at the mention of Robert Graves, and that's all in there. But if you want to know how Steve Moore felt, then you should read Somnium.
I have read Somnium.
Yeah.
I have.
That's a strange book.
Yes, I mean, I can empathize with a lot of what he writes.
Yeah.
And the way he felt alienated from the current paradigm to the nth degree.
Yeah.
And I can feel for that, because there are times, many times, that I feel like I don't belong as well in this time and age. But at the same time, you have, after, I don't know, there is a lot of, not that Steve's art was like this, but there is a lot of art nowadays that focuses on the negative, the nihilistic kind of aspect, but that leaves you with nowhere to go after.
With Steve and with Somnium,
I wouldn't call him a nihilist. He was a romantic, definitely,
absolutely,
like idealizing past times. But
at the same time, there is such a lot of sorrow,
a lot
in Somnium, and reading it after Steve's death, because I'd been reading it as he was working on it, and so I hadn't got a sense of the sweep of the novel.
Yeah.
But reading it after his death, certain things kind of leapt out at me. And one of the things was that, considering it is, in the broad sense, an erotic novel, in that it pertains to love. Yeah. However, there's a lot of titillation in the book. There is absolutely no erotic consummation, which I thought was a little odd, and I spoke to Steve about that, and I got the impression that he thought that would have turned it into a pornography, which wasn't what he wanted. I did notice, however, how much weeping there is in the book. How often the characters are in paroxysms of tears. Yeah. And it struck me that in a kind of blinding flash, I suddenly realised, the weeping, that is the orgasm. Yeah, that is the convulsion, the expression of salt fluids, and you always feel so much better afterwards. But it's an emotional release rather than a physical one. Yeah. It's
right. That's a very insightful reading.
Well, it's a book that gets. I'm going to read it again, and I suspect it will get stranger for me on every reading.
No, I will too, because of this conversation.
Yeah, it's. But no, the Cellini book. That is the man's thoughts, kind of preserved in amber. Yeah. His thought processes, how he came to his conclusions.
The way I see this book is also a bit like a mystic marriage. It is the expression, the spiritual offspring of Steve and the goddess Selene, to whom he devoted his life, his heart, his lifeblood, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I think I mentioned this in the afterword of the book, but that as far as we can tell, he finished putting the last full stops upon that manuscript, and he stood up and he died, which was all as Cellini had promised him in a conversation in his head, sort of some nearly 20 years before.
Yeah, when he said, "Take me home."
Take me home, and she said, "Do you really want me to?" And he said, and then eventually she said, "I'll take you home when your book about me is finished." And she seemed to follow that to the letter. But yeah, that it's all still there. That stuff is preserved, just as the vanished streets of Northampton are preserved in a way any other way would be unnatural. But even if I made so much money for Northampton with this film that they were to actually say, look, we're going to rebuild the boroughs exactly as it was, down to the last sort of blade of grass. And we're probably going to pay actors to play all of the people that... No, that would be a horrible travesty. Yeah. That would be like Westworld or something like that. It's sort of, no, that's not the way to preserve things. No. It's to accept everything in the material world will go. So preserve it in the immaterial world, because the immaterial world is forever.
You are familiar, I suppose, I'm pretty sure that you are, with the occult concept of the egregore. Egregor, egregoras in Greek, I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly in English, Egregore. Egregor. So it's like the concept of the tulpa in Tibetan Buddhism. It's a massive thought form that is comprised of not the thoughts of just one person, but of groups as well, especially like when there is ritual involved and invocations and like building this thought form and feeding it. You create this being. So it's the egregor is basically how you create gods, how humankind creates gods. Do you think there is a correlation with the artistic process there? So you write a book, you create all these characters, you preserve in amber, as you said about Steve and his book on Selene, a part of your soul. So do you turn yourself into an egregor, something immortal that is other than you, however?
Well, you perhaps not so much turn yourself into one as generate one. And some of this, I mean, on a base level, that there's, if you've got any kind of celebrity, and if that celebrity is largely with a certain group of people who are perhaps more inclined towards fantasizing about things than others, then you will find that inevitably you find these unrecognizable reflections of yourself in culture. That I notice that I am often being portrayed as a furiously angry individual. That really, from the moment he wakes up in the morning to the moment that he goes to bed at night, is snarling about sort of something that he's aggrieved about. Now, I can only imagine that this is people who've noticed how I tend to behave to corporations that I have a political grievance with because they've stolen intellectual property and money from me.
There's nothing worse than having somebody steal your intellectual property from you.
Of course. And these are people who have also stolen the intellectual properties of much better people than them who I met and cared about. They have a history of doing this. So if I protest about that, then it's kind of a convenient thing certainly for the publishers and the people in editorial, and for an awful lot of the readers, because if they actually had to address what I'm saying, they might not feel so good
about themselves,
about going to see the next Avengers movie because they don't want to think about Jack Kirby. They might not feel so good about their hobby. And so it's much easier to typify me as somebody who is irrationally angry about everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
I believe one of the amusing quotes was, Alan Moore says, "Get off my lawn." You know, so this is to say that he's indignant about everything. So really nothing that he's angry about is of any real importance. You tend to find that these imaginary selves, they tend to obscure what you are, but it is inevitable that this is another thing that relates to magic, and something that Crowley said, which I've found to be true. He was talking about in his commentary upon the High Priestess path in tarot. He was saying that he gave this cryptic little comment saying that all of the aspirants to the the Argentum Astrum,
you
might as well say to magic. You know, all of the aspirants to magic are men. All of the brothers of the AA are women. Now, that takes a while to get your head round. But what he's saying is is that is the trajectory of all real magicians. And you might add to that all real artists, because I think the terms are pretty much interchangeable. And you start out as something that wishes to penetrate a mystery. Whether you're biologically a man or a woman, you as an artist, as a magician, you are trying to be the thing that penetrates this mystery. After a while, you will inevitably find, if you're good enough at it, that you end up being the mystery that other people are trying to penetrate. You have become female. That's an interesting dynamic.
It is, very much.
And it sort of, it does describe, the magical career and the artistic career, that you will end up inevitably becoming, because you are the most visible public exponent of magic or of art, then people who want to understand magic or art, they're going to try and understand you. So, yeah, I imagine that in the future there will be some kind of endlessly revised composite of what Alan Moore was. Much the same as we can't know what William Blake was.
No.
But we have our image of each of us in our heads and hearts has got our own private William Blake. Who kind of is an angelic expression of everything that we think is best about humanity.
Because that's what he preserved in his work.
Yes.
What was more perfected in him, that's what he has handed us
down. That's
what
he spoke of. That was his art. That was him. Yeah.
I want to read something to you. It's from the Greek magical papyri, the Mithras liturgy, and it says, "Yoke your speech and breath into these prayers, and you can ascend to heaven and become immortal." So you speak in Jerusalem, you speak of eternity, and you have said that if you manage through these works to make people live in eternity as they should and not in fear, then you have succeeded.
That is my feeling. It was, I remember reading, I think, The Western Lands by William Burroughs.
Yes.
Where he starts it out by saying, in this particular year, the writer William Lee, which was his own surrogate, decided to write his way around death. And I thought, that's a good ambition. Could you write your way around death? And that was one of the impulses that went into Jerusalem. And I was satisfied with it. At the end of the book, I thought, you've written your way around death. And I got a wonderful letter from a guy who said that he just finished Jerusalem and he wanted to write and thank me because since he was a child, he could remember a specific afternoon when he was 7 or 8 or something. He was sitting on the sofa, he was eating a wine gum. And in that moment, he suddenly understood that he and everybody that he knew was going to die. Now, we've all had a similar moment, I'm sure, that back when you're a child and you first get that concept.
For sure, yeah.
But he said for him, it kind of opened up a space in him that was a kind of a welcome home for depression and anxieties that had more or less overshadowed the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And he said that he'd been to some excellent analysts and therapists, but they hadn't been able to get around that central core issue, which is we're all going to die. He said that after reading Jerusalem, he felt a lot better because it's giving people another alternative.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the only alternative that I was issued, and I think most people, is either a heaven and an afterlife that you do not believe in because it is a ridiculous childish fantasy, or the nothingness of atheism. Now, And I would probably have tended more towards the nothingness of atheism, because if the alternative is a kind of marble and gold heaven full of angels singing God's praises, no, I don't fancy that much.
No.
It sounds a bit middle class for me.
Yeah.
It sounds like a plasterer's bathroom, you know. So in having another alternative and one that is actually based upon science, that is, I felt good about that. And I've had other people saying, yes, I don't feel so bad about death because, and it also focuses people upon life. And I think Nietzsche, who'd got a similar idea about this recurrence, although not based upon the same principles as me, because he was pre-Einstein.
Yes.
But sort of, he was saying that even if this should turn out not to be true, somebody who lived as if it were true would have a better life.
Yes.
And because it focuses you upon now, it's not upon some reward in the hereafter. I mean, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was a very religious woman, and she had a life of endless poverty and deprivation, losing children, things like that. But she believed that when she got to heaven, the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and that poor people would finally get what they deserved in heaven. And so, and you have to think, yeah, I'm glad she had that comfort, but if she hadn't had it, might she have struggled for a better life here on earth?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't a lot of that faith what has led to deferred revolutions? You know, all right, we are living in a terribly oppressed state, but if we can just stick it out till we die and not kind of have an uprising and kill everybody, then we'll probably get to heaven. I wanted an alternative to that. I wanted something that focused people upon the here and now,
being
and
present,
this world.
Which is the epitome of magic. And if you want to work magic, you have to be present. You have to be in the now.
Yes.
So,
and also to say that, yeah, this is heaven. This is hell. It's right here. It's right now. This is the magical landscape. This is the mythical landscape. We are the immortal beings.
Reminds me of the quote by Milton from Paradise Lost, "The mind is its own place."
Yes.
And in itself, it can make a heaven out of hell, a hell of heaven, like the Lucifer quote from
Milton. I mean, these are giants to me, giants of the English language as a visionary language.
A visionary language.
That sort of, you know, that runs right the way from John Wycliffe and the Lollards translating the Bible into English, all the way through Clare and,
Clare, who is
and Joyce and sort of William Blake and John Bunyan, Milton, all of those people.
You see, that's why I liked in Jerusalem how Lucia Joyce seems to be able to speak to people disconnected in time, because this is what happens when you read poetry, when you write poetry books, you transcend time and space. It's like the Whitman quote where he says, "Time avails not and distance avails not between us." This is the only way to do it. For me, at least now, it's the only method of time traveling that we have.
Of course.
Books.
And I mean, Lucia Joyce, I mean, she was in that, the St Andrew's Hospital. Yeah. All the while I was at the school next door. I would probably have glimpsed her through the railings.
Without knowing.
But she is a marvellous figure. And, I mean, that chapter of Jerusalem, I had to take a break of about 2 years after that, where I did my underground magazine, Dodge and Logic, just because that had been so intense. And, yeah, Lucia is a marvellous symbol of, you know, I mean, the terrible treatment that she received. And this was from somebody who, as a dancer, people were expecting her fame to eclipse her father's. And yet she chose to live here. This was the asylum that she liked. This was where she wanted to be buried. It's and I think that me and Melinda have got plans. We've got we're hopefully going to be buried in the same cemetery as Lucia, sort of. Which
I hope that will be many, many years from now.
Well, let's hope so. But sort of Melinda did a lovely painting of me and her dressed in our wedding clothes, dancing with Lucia Joyce.
That's beautiful. Amongst
all of these tombstones.
Very beautiful.
It's sort of, but yeah, I mean, this is one of the. I'm sure that everywhere is like this, or maybe not. Maybe Northampton is special, but sort of, we have had such a lot of wonderful, extraordinary people pass through this place. It's perhaps true if you looked at any place, but Lucia Joyce, you know, I mean, like, and she does kind of represent in my kind of genealogy of visionary writing and language, she does represent in some ways a kind of the avant-garde, and the avant-garde at the point where it was entering the pop world.
Okay, yes.
Where this tradition that had begun with John Wycliffe and John Bunyan and all the rest of them reached this point where it was suddenly going to explode into a popular realm.
Okay.
You know, and she was right there. It's yeah, that was probably the chapter that I, in retrospect, enjoyed the most. At the time, it was hellish, and I could barely speak English after I finished writing it. But it sort of
I can imagine
that was a lot of fun looking back. I was using that kind of glossolalia. If you start to mess around with language, it's a bit like in magic. They advise you to invoke often using barbarous names.
Yes.
Which basically means any language that you don't understand, because we base the whole world upon language, as Count Alfred Korbzinski said. That sort of is pretty much all language.
Yeah.
And so if you mess around with the language, you are messing around with reality.
Yeah, and the sound as well.
Yeah, the sound changes. It's sort of, and you're unable to apply meaning in the same way to words as you did. So that shifts things. And when I did like Voice of the Fire in the first Hobbs Hog.
The first chapter, which is incidentally my favorite. I know many people.
I think it probably is mine as well. Thank you for that. That's it's probably mine as well.
I really love that chapter. It was hard to read, obviously.
But once you get into it,
once you get into it, that's the language that you speak.
Yeah.
You become used to the flow, the rhythm of the language, and it's realistic, because at the time, obviously, the vocabulary wouldn't be like it
anywhere
is.
near as big as it is today.
Yeah, and the syntax would be different, the grammar. You made me see through the eyes of a person of the cave.
You can do that with it was the same with the Lucia Joyce chapter. My brother, who is the frankly disappointing hero of Jerusalem, and sort of when he read it, and that was actually the reaction that I was most eager to hear. He read the whole thing. He read the Lucia Joyce chapter. He's never read a literary novel in his life. You know, this was the first time that he'd read a literary novel.
He started with something.
Well, and he said,
very advanced.
I said, so what did you think to the Lucia Joyce chapter? And he said, well, it was really hard at first, but then I found that after I'd got into it a little bit, I forgot that it was actually written in a different language. Yes. He said, I was just kind of absorbing it as if that was normal.
Yeah, that was my experience as well with both these chapters, both the Hobsbawm and the Lucia.
And it does put you into the character, into their worldview, because our language, it is our worldview. It's how we see things.
Yeah. It is amazing how you can immerse people in another reality through language. Which brings me to something that I wanted to ask you before when we were speaking about technology. Recently, I was suggested by a friend that I do a PhD on how to teach literature through technology. Because in the future, there is going to be all these technological advancements. Technology will be the place to go to learn anything. Now, as a writer myself, and I want your opinion in this, I don't know how to feel about this because I remember something that you said a while ago about how important it was as you were growing up as a working class person to be able to have access to just a simple piece of paper and a pen.
Yes.
And that was your spaceship that made you create all these worlds. And it was important that you had these very, very simple means. Yeah. So if these means are taken from us
if it's all technological, then that immediately you're going to have a huge gulf between the people who can afford that technology and the people who can't. But you're also going to get the person's relationship with their own art will change. People speak as if there is no discernible difference between, say, print media and online media.
Massive.
But that is making a huge mistake. I mean, I know that when I, for example, it's a slightly different subject, but it's related.
Yeah.
That when I talk about how important fanzines were to me when I was growing up, both buying them and making them, and how that whole self-published, the poetry magazine culture that was around in the 70s, which all of these people like, Ian Sinclair, Alan Fisher, all of these brilliant British poets, they thrived in that connect. Now, people can say, well, today there are fanzines online, but that's not the same, is it?
Because you don't have the immediacy of the ritual of going to buy it, of holding it in your hands.
You don't have the artifact. Yeah. You don't also, that if you do a fanzine with a group of mates at school, you perhaps get together about 10 quid to print it or whatever, and you price it so that you're going to get that much back and perhaps 50 pence over. You do that, and you've got all of that experience. You've got, the interacting with other people, physically putting something together, and that is entirely yours. It is not existing purely because of the only way that you can make money from anything online is advertisements, isn't it?
Yeah.
By people or enterprises that you might not agree with. And in fact, you might not agree with advertising.
Yeah.
Full stop. I certainly never had any advertising in Dodge and Logic because I thought that would compromise us. So immediately, you're mainly doing this for someone like Mark Zuckerberg or one of these kind of pasty-faced masters of the world.
Yeah.
You are doing it entirely to profit them. You don't have that physical connection with other people that would be created by them having to print a magazine, put it in an envelope, write your address on the front, perhaps put a little note to you inside it, send it through the post, and then you would perhaps treasure it for the next 50 years, or you'd perhaps throw it away. But it's a completely different level of interaction.
Yeah, exactly.
And back then, say poetry magazines and fanzines and things like that, that was when we had a counterculture.
Mm.
And we have, since, as far as I can see, we've not had a counterculture since the very early 1990s.
Yeah, I agree.
That, and countercultures were by no means perfect or ideal, and they probably always ended up getting assimilated by mass culture.
Mm-hmm.
But I've come to realise that actually counterculture, it's not a separate thing to mass culture. They're like two valves of the same organ, and actually they can't function without each other. And if you get rid of counterculture because it's become an annoyance, then culture itself will atrophy.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we are now.
Because that's where it gets its nourishment from.
Yeah, it's the only way it can progress. It's the front edge of things. A counterculture is vital in the same way that in the arts, the avant-garde is vital. I've recently became quite infatuated with the American writer David Foster Wallace. I just like some of his style and his intelligence.
Yeah.
But one of the things that he said was that he was really angry about the failure of the avant-garde. And I can see what he means. I think that what he meant was that the avant-garde is crucial.
Yeah.
If art and culture and humanity are to move on, then it needs to have a forward cutting edge. It needs to have an avant-garde. And yet, most avant-garde material is unwatchable, unreadable, unlistenable, alienating.
Yeah.
It is nothing that anybody can embrace or lose themselves in. So that's the challenge, isn't it? How do you take material that is progressive, whether you're talking about magical ideas or whether you're talking about any kind of progression? How do you actually come up with a form of art that is compelling enough to actually instill those ideas into ordinary people? And I think that that's rather up to us, and it is something which is within our power. We could get that good if we just believed in ourselves a bit more and believed a bit more in the importance of art and what it is, that it's not something that's to be disposed of and to be cut out of all of the university courses just when we have a bit of financial difficulty. It is not so. It is the purpose of civilization. When we look back at civilization and our history, we don't think, oh, that was a good war. Yeah. Oh, that killed a lot of people. That was a high point. We look back at the high points of culture. We look back at that painting, at that piece of music, at that kind of architecture. It's that is how we measure ourselves as humans. So I don't want to hear about it suddenly becoming unimportant in the 21st century or having been superseded by something more important, because I don't believe it has been. I think that as we progress further and further into our nightmarish future, I think that we have to rely more and more upon the information and the knowledge of the past, the things that we put aside, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because they were no longer fashionable. Or because there were political circumstances that made them no longer quite so convenient. You know, we ought to look at that stuff. And I think there are signs that we are doing that. I mean, I was interviewed a few months ago by a New Scientist.
Oh, I didn't know this.
Yeah, well, you see, this is it. I do...
That escaped me.
I do a number of or at least a while back, I was doing, with my friend Robin Ince, I would do a number of appearances on his Infinite Monkey Cage show, or I'd be appearing down at various gigs that Robin was organising down in London at the Bloomsbury Theatre, where I'd be hanging around with a lot of comedians
a lot of scientists
and an awful lot of scientists. And I think that I have become the snake worshipper that it's okay for scientists to hang around with. I think that most of the scientists that I talk to realise the degree of nuance in what I'm saying, and that I'm not just saying, yeah, there's a magic snake that created the entire universe, that it's something a little bit more subtle and complex than that, and that I respect I respect science. It's just that I don't think that science has got any place in trying to analyse the internal realm. I think that is rather the role of art and magic. But it's the very fact that I can be taken seriously by the people at New Scientist. And I had a really nice lunch with Rowan Hooper, who's the assistant editor, and I mean, he pointed out in his article that I do have what many of his readers might consider some strange ideas. But he does point out that at the start of my career, when I was doing Swamp Thing, I was talking about vegetable consciousness and the idea of a connectedness in vegetable consciousness. He said, which actually science has now proven exists. So he was saying, so maybe some of his other ideas aren't quite so wild after all. Now, this is a tremendous admission, and I was very grateful for it, because with the rise of the fundamentalist right in America, you got a kind of reaction to that from equally fundamentalist atheists, mentioning no names but Richard Dawkins, who were basically making a religion which only means bound together in one belief. They were making a religion out of atheism, and they were attaching dogmas to it, and they were defending those dogmas vigorously and behaving exactly in the way that churches do. I think that the real problem is religious thinking. I think that it is not natural for us all to be bound together in one belief. We're not bound together in one physical appearance or one set of emotions or one set of intellectual capabilities or whatever. So why should our spiritual life be anything other than that of the individual? Which is to say, that is an approach to spirituality that is that of, not of the mystic, it is of the magician.
The magician, exactly.
Or the artist. Where as an artist, as a magician, you are only answerable to yourself. Your work is a pact between you and the universe. I think that all artists and magicians are probably naturally anarchists, or at least probably should be, but that's just me.
Reminds me of the Havamal, the god Odin. He says, myself to myself I sacrificed, and it is exactly what you just said.
Yes, it is exactly. It is all within the single individual. This whole universe is all in our heads. I had a moment during one of my magical experiences where just for a second I understood that all of the stars, all of the suns, all of the phenomena of the universe only existed within my mind. And I knew that that was definitely true, but it was too big a thought and I couldn't, I let it go. But looking back, there is a level upon which that is inarguably true. I mean, that none of us experience the universe directly. We only experience the photons hitting our retinas, the vibrations in the tympana of our ears, the chemical impressions that we're picking up with the cilia of our nostrils or upon our tongue. So, and we're composing all of this moment by moment into this tapestry that we call reality. But that is not reality. That is our perception of reality, which is all we can ever know. So in a real sense, yeah, all the stars in the sky, they only exist inside your mind.
I totally agree with you. As a visionary artist that you are, as a magician, living in this world where there is nuclear waste, there is genocide, there is violence, this is what is around you. How do you feed your fire? How do you keep going and find balance between, on one hand, the world, the different states of consciousness you access through your creativity and your visionary capacity, and on the other hand, what has been created by people who have no vision, or who rather, instead of dreaming, they produce nightmares.
So how do you progress in this world?
And yes, and how do you keep
How do
your
I get by?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, downstairs in my living room, I've got a little altar that is cluttered with all sorts of marvelous occult junk. And there is my picture of Glycon. Yeah. Upstairs in my bedroom, when Steve died, I took the little tiny picture of Selene, and I took the entourage of other figures that Selene had accumulated during her years with Steve. And Melinda bought a doll's house, and she painted it beautifully in kind of blue violets that are kind of appropriate for Selene. Yeah. And then we furnished it, and we put the little picture there, and we also went out, Melinda went out and got little figurines that kind of resemble Steve and his brother Chris. And so that is by my bed every morning when I wake up. I have conversations with Glycon. I have conversations with Steve and Selene. The fact that they exist as no more than idea forms isn't really that much of an impediment. Yeah. And when problems emerge, one of the great things about having a relationship with a God, whether the God is there or not, yes, is that you can delegate upwards. And this always works. It's like, even with a tiny thing like creative decisions, like if I was asked by anybody, show me something that you did that was magic that could not have been done without magic, I would probably show them a couple of issues of, say, Promethea, where with the last issue of Promethea, I had, during a magical experience, I had suddenly been visited by the conviction that the last issue of Promethea should be issue 32, and that it was going to be two beautiful psychedelic posters that somehow, or it was going to be a narrative that somehow turned into two beautiful psychedelic posters. And because that was some months in advance, I just thought, oh yeah, I'll do that then. When I got closer to it and thought, how am I going to do it? And I went to see Steve, and we worked on a little piece of folded paper that he folded into 32 pages, and then he numbered them all carefully. And when he opened it out, some of them were upside down, some of them were on different sides of the paper. And I thought, how can you actually get any kind of narrative? I really don't see how this is, let alone how can you make a coherent picture? And at that point, I would have given up because it seemed impossible. However, since I'd been told by the gods that that was what I was going to do, I didn't have that option. I didn't have the option of abandoning it just because it was impossible. So I carried on and found out that actually there was a way to do it, and that it was really brilliant and it was everything that I wanted. But I only got to that point because I believed in a possibly imaginary set of entities that were directing me.
Yes.
So whether they were there or not, that was something that I accomplished, which I could not have accomplished by other means. It's this is, I think, what we have to understand. I was talking with Robin Ince about this, and I was saying, look, you don't have to say that gods are real, because none of us can say that. And what do we mean by real? In what sense? You don't have to say that gods are real. All you have to say is that the God experience is real.
Yeah.
That doesn't violate any of the laws of physics. And it does perhaps raise the God experience as an interesting field of study and endeavour. That I start to see a shift in how rational science is seeing itself and is seeing the world. You can see that psychedelic drugs are when they were completely suppressed during the 60s and all research on them stopped. Now they've found that actually they're marvellous as antidepressants, that they can cure things like alcoholism or addictive behaviour, and that they seem to offer people genuine insights into themselves that have lasting value. It's sort of, this is what I mean by the upside of moving to a more virtual or imagination-centred space. This is what it could be.
This is what it's
I suspect that we will probably have to go through, what would you call it, the clip-off of Yesod, the husk of the imagination. I suspect that that's where we are now, where it's not so much fantasy and fiction, it's outright lies and uncertainty and the sense that reality is kind of shifting under your feet. And I think this is probably a phase that we have to go through in order to actually align ourselves around a kind of a new pole. You know, the pole of the imagination rather than of materiality.
You have a very beautiful word in Voice of the Fire. You say, we are spark-born.
Spark-born.
So
yeah.
What does it mean to be spark-born, and how do we become spark? How do we remain spark-born in this?
Well, I mean, in Voice of the Fire, I was, I think, specifically referring to the beginning of cremation.
Yeah, it was cremation.
But yes, the phrase does have application beyond that.
Yeah,
and
I think so too.
I suppose to be spark-born would be to recognise that the element of fire is the most significant and powerful of the elements, because that is the element that relates to spirit. That we should focus not upon our bodies, because we have bodies, but our bodies aren't us. We should focus not upon our emotions, because we have emotions, but our emotions aren't us. The same thing goes for our intellect. The same thing goes for our imaginations. We have these things, but it is the we that has these things. It is the self, the person at the centre of us, the voice that we only hear intermittently.
Yeah.
That is nevertheless our true voice. That is what should be in the driving seat. If you live your life centered entirely upon the physical world and physical sensation, yes, you'll probably have a very enjoyable physical life, but you will have no control over it. And you will be buffeted by all of the same things that everybody else is. The same thing goes if you live a life of pure intellect or a life governed entirely by your emotions. These will all end up as not working out. Your imagination, it is, as we've said, it is one of the most wonderful things within the human compass.
Yeah.
But if that imagination is not under the governance of will, then it is a treacherous sucking bog that people can waste their lives in, just clinging to some fantasy that completely exhausts all of their time, and they never accomplish anything because, well, when I win the lottery, when this happens, oh, won't that be great? And you spend your entire life just imagining something rather than actually doing it. Yeah, it's important. All of these things, you have to be in the driver's seat, which is the soul, which is Tiferet, which is the solar center of the Kabbalah. Then your life is your own. And that is, I think, that what we have to do as individuals, and we have to do that as a society, because, as it says in the Emerald Tablet, as above, so below, the microcosm and the macrocosm, if we heal our society, then I don't think that we would be as fragmented. I think that we are fragmented because we live in a fragmented society that doesn't have a coherent view of the world, not even to itself. It could not explain the world in its own terms because its own terms don't make sense. So this is the great work.
Yeah.
You know, the great work is sort yourself out. And in doing so, sort society out.
Yeah.
It's sort of, which is, it's tough, but nobody ever promised us a rose garden. And whoever thought that art or magic was going to be easy, you know, so we should woman up. We should grow a pair of ovaries and just be sufficient to our times, you know.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add?
I think we've more or less covered everything.
I think so too.
That's not been a bad couple of hours of conversation there, Lena.
Thank you so much.
It's been
for
my
your voice
pleasure.
of fire.
Well, no, thank you for everything. This has been a great afternoon.